Gibraltar is both universal and local, both macroscopic and microscopic. Gibraltarians shared the global experience of the coronavirus outbreak, yet the rock's unique culture and geography shaped their distinct path through the pandemic. Gibraltar became one of the first countries on the planet to fully vaccinate its adult population. As masks are discarded, restrictions lifted, and sporting events resume, Gibraltar has become a test bed for the return to normal. History is still unfolding, but 1 year on, Gibraltarians are telling their stories of life in the bubble.
As of this morning, there have been 571 cases confirmed by the Chinese government, and 17 people are reported to have died of this new strain of respiratory illness.
I'm very concerned. Now that you brought it to my attention, I'll stay away from most people wearing masks.
Using for sports facilities for stuff related directly to the pandemic was what's the word I use? Daunting, scary.
Trying to work out whether we could deal with this or not was difficult. I remember the Director of Public Health telling the COVID Exco, as it was then, the numbers of casualties that we might see in Gibraltar.
So I had to make that presentation, I had to make that case, and I said, simply enough, Chief Minister, if we follow the case fatality rate that is that the World Health Organization talking about, which they presented, 3.4%.
The world remains dangerously unprepared for a global pandemic. For too long, the world has operated on a cycle of panic and neglect. We throw money at an outbreak, and when it's over, we forget about it and do nothing to prevent the next one. This is dangerously short-sighted and frankly difficult to understand. If we fail to prepare, we're preparing to fail.
I said, I cannot think of a biological reason why Gibraltar is densely populated. What does a case fatality rate of 3.4% represent? And I said, even if you take a better case scenario, that the population fatality rate, which is the whole population, is coming in about 1% at the time. So I said, if you work it through, you're talking about anything from 100 to 300 deaths.
You don't think about that too much when you think about the infrastructure of Gibraltar. You don't think about pathology and the cemetery and the mortuary. You pay your government to think about those things. And your government has really been able to deal with those things for many generations in Gibraltar. But when you're told that you could face 400 people dead in 1 month, you realize that you haven't got the infrastructure to deal with 400 dead in 1 month. You haven't got the infrastructure to do the pathology, to know whether they died with or from COVID. You haven't got the infrastructure to keep them. You haven't got the infrastructure to bury them. And guess what? You haven't got the space to bury them.
Pictures began to show lots of hospitals piling up with people, bodies, and that brought something home. And then, of course, there was the picture in Spain.
The impact of COVID-19 is not seen equally by everyone. Its most brutal effects are confined to the homes of the sick and to hospitals. By late March 2020, 2 months after the first confirmed case of coronavirus in Spain, the country had reported over 4,000 deaths. Videos of overwhelmed Spanish hospitals caused shock in neighbouring Gibraltar. The densely populated community of Madrid was the worst affected.
That was terrifying. I was really, really scared. I was scared at many levels. Obviously, you think of yourself and your family and how will you survive it, seeing these people dying in the corridors, no? And clearly the world wasn't ready for it. And we should have been, because people have predicted this before, and there will be more pandemics. Let's hope, we're better prepared. But it was frightening. And I could picture, having worked in the hospital for several times in my life, I could picture our own corridors full of people. I said, what can we do to prevent this?
It'll spread quite widely. What I can't tell you is how quickly it'll spread. Ideally, we would want to delay its spread. Why would we want to delay its spread? Because we don't want everybody, absolutely everybody, to fall ill at the same time. If that happens, then when people want to go to hospital, our staff will be ill. I would say in a close community such as Gibraltar, I'd say that nearly everybody will at some point get it.
And Sohail painted a picture which fortunately didn't come to be until much later on, and predicting the possibility of hundreds of deaths. That was tough, and I remember, because the meetings were also cabinet meetings and also the COVID platinum that were together, and the chief minister.
I'm a different politician.
Look, one of the most horrible things I've had to do is give an instruction for 200 niches to be built in our cemetery, because we had to be ready for that, and that was a horrible thing to do, but it had to be done.
This was going to hit us at the time that we had never seen levels of fatalities being as bad, and for that reason we saw the capacity of cemeteries and burials, and it was certainly not going to be enough to what we required. So part of the plans was to create the niches that the Ministry of Environment actually did.
The next step came when we all know now these niches were built, and we think, oh God, really, are we expecting that level of death? But then you get the call that we need to use the newly built multi-use games area, which is just behind us and is now going to canopy. It's now a covered, what we were hoping, covered sports hall, to win. And I can say this now because it's well known in the community. It's not, I don't know whether it's been said officially or not, but it's definitely well known that they were 2 refrigerated trucks that were planned or were on standby as a morgue, a spill-off of the morgue.
Because if more than 2 of those bodies have to go into the same burial plot, you can't open the plot more than a year or less than a year before you put somebody else in. So I vividly remember the meeting in the bunker where we're given that information, and the consequences of that information start to trickle through. So we had to order portable mortuary capacity, which we put into the sports hall. And we had to, I still feel shaky when I talk about it, we had to order niches to set up at North Front Cemetery, because we might have had to put people into a niche whilst we waited for a year to pass since their most recent relative had died from COVID, and we had the ability to put them where they would want to be with their families. So you really start to understand the human cost of dealing with a huge pandemic like this, and how the infrastructure of Gibraltar is, thank goodness, not set up for those numbers of casualties that we might have to deal with. You really don't want to be in a meeting where you're the decision maker and you're told that, believe me.
And it wasn't easy. I did a presentation to my clinicians, the doctors we have an educational setting on a Friday, and I painted that scenario of the 1%, the 3.4% mortality, and people were traumatized. There were people who said, how can you say this? You have made, I won't be able to sleep at night. You've got to give us it in a more gentle way. What are you doing? And the problem for me was, I was not sleeping at night because I saw the tsunami coming.
During 2020, Gibraltar had kept the spread of the virus more or less under control, but cases started to rise alarmingly at the end of the year. Like everyone, Gibraltarians were weary of restrictions. Dire predictions of the local impact of coronavirus had not come to pass. But a wave was coming, and the spike would be sharp. In the first month of the new year, cases surged to over 4,000. In 2020, Gibraltar had recorded 7 COVID-related deaths. By the end of January 2021, the virus had claimed the lives of 77 Gibraltarians. In this tight-knit community, almost everyone was affected in one way or another. The pandemic has been divisive at times. People have questioned who to trust. Conversations have been heated in households, on social media. Yet shared trauma can also unite communities. New efforts started to slow the spread. But Gibraltar had also recorded the second highest COVID-related death rate per capita.
I'm shaken to the core by the knowledge that since I addressed Parliament just 72 hours ago, 21 of our fellow Gibraltarians have died of complications related to COVID. Gibraltar has not experienced such loss of life in such a short time since the 1951 explosion of the Royal Fleet Auxiliary ammunition ship, the Bedenham. Now, 38 Gibraltarians have died in the last 18 days since the start of the year. In the last 24 hours alone, we have lost another 2 of our fellow Gibraltarians to this awful virus. This is now the worst loss of life of Gibraltarians in over 100 years. Even in war, we have never lost so many in such a short time.
Our services have been under a massive strain. Our staff numbers have been pushed to the limits. We've had to make some tough decisions about bringing patients back into Gibraltar from other ICUs because we know that our own capacity was getting to the very, very limits, and if a patient was already in a place of safety, it was decided it was better to keep them there than to put additional burden onto a system that was right at the edge of its ability to cope. There are plenty of times I will walk into a bay and the nurse will just be holding the patient's hand. There's music playing in the background on the ICU, often that patient's favourite music. Even though we are completely restricting access to the ICU for patient safety and for visitor safety, in the situation where a patient is unfortunately losing their battle with COVID and approaching an end of life, we do have a mechanism to allow compassionate visiting so the family can be with them for those last few hours.
Because I had to take the most extreme position, because I could see the extreme position, and people themselves could see it on their TVs, that had its, that was a bit like a scorpion in its effect. There was a sting in the tail to this. And the sting in the tail was that people began to deny there was a problem. They did not see that it existed. They wanted to accept that this was all overhyped. I received a lot of bad press, both in social media and in the proper media, where so at least one of the newspapers challenged, and I think it's perfectly legitimate for them to ask. They wanted me to apologise for frightening elderly people. I was shouted at on the Rock by people who said, because of you, my parents have been frightened of going out. What are you doing? And you know, that's a really difficult judgment. How hard and how much do you put fear into people to make? But you know, in a sense, what happened afterwards illustrates that I was, in some respects, right. This is a disease that leaves, we didn't know enough about that disease, and apparently through long haul COVID, it leaves a residue that can last for a long time. We don't know how long at the moment.
A novel coronavirus was first reported in Wuhan at the end of 2019. It has thrived in human hosts ever since. China had learned from previous health crises. SARS outbreaks between 2002 and 2004 were also caused by strains of coronavirus. As the new virus spread, temporary hospitals were constructed with astonishing speed. Gyms and exhibition halls were converted into medical facilities. In Wuhan alone, 16 such facilities were built in 16 days. COVID-19 is not a fair disease. Some people show no symptoms. Others suffer horribly. And some die. We don't know everything yet. Symptoms vary, but around the planet, infected people have gasped for breath. The desperate need for oxygen will endure as a cruel memory of this pandemic. In April 2020, Gibraltar Health Authority opened its own Nightingale Field Hospital. The Europa Sports Park was the designated site. The military and volunteers joined the effort. This temporary facility had capacity for over 300 beds, and everybody hoped that they would never be used.
And then you got Nightingale, which went from hosting a snooker event, or snooker event, 2 days later, being taken over to create Nightingale. I know anybody who's been in that hospital when it was set up, at the start, it's very eerie, because you could just imagine what that place full could sound and look like.
I think when we started fixing up the Nightingale, it was sort of automatic pilot. So we set up all the beds, we set up the bedside tables, we did all the beds, all the cleaning we set up. It was a clinical area. And for me, it wasn't until I went up to the balcony and looked down and saw the magnitude of beds that I thought, oh my God, if this ever fills up, I hope we're going to be able to manage it. It wasn't until that point that I felt the magnitude of the pandemic that we were living.
And one of the other things I learned through the pandemic flu, we would need to have either step up or step down facility. So again, garnering people to get the equipment to get a Nightingale facility set up was a job and a half, but we did it in a week.
So from a training and development background, what I've been looking at is the patient journey and the staff we've got and the equipment we've got. So we've been running drills, looking at if a patient arrived, making sure we could go through everything from fundamental essential care right through to emergency care and resuscitation, and how those procedures will work. To put everything in place to accept a transfer from St Bernard's Hospital, to make sure we have a structured process so that we can identify the patients that are most appropriate to be nursed here. However, if they do come here and they deteriorate, we will make sure that's picked up on early and arrange transfer back to St Bernard's Hospital, which will have the more high dependency critical care nursing structure in place. However, we are able to cater for patients requiring up to 15 litres of oxygen initially until we await for transfer back from St Bernard's Hospital. Just remember walking in and just seeing reams and reams of white curtains and just thinking, how am I going to make this somewhere that if my relative has to come, it's going to be the equivalent to a hospital experience? How are we going to safeguard patients who we can't manage in that environment? How are we going to make sure we can adapt safety-wise when we're now a remote location, we're not in the hospital, where we've got critical care unit at our fingertips, where we've got radiology, etc. Quite quickly we identified we need to establish what kind of patients we could take there.
2 different levels of oxygen support. So we have these compressors, and they will give you 5 litres For the non-acute respiratory patient, then we would have our large oxygen cylinders that we can rev up to 15 litres per minute. So a patient becomes unwell here, they would have to be transported back to the hospital via ambulance. So this will support the patient initially, and then we would be able to transfer them back to the hospital.
And some of the things that happened were truly heroic. You know, we had to put in oxygen facilities, we had to get beds, where could we get them from? When the rest of the world was competing with us. And again, there were pilots that flew off to China to bring stuff back. There were people who tried to procure swabs from, I think there was a speedboat to Malaga that was organised. There were all kinds of things that I think in years to come will be enough material to have some plays, if not films, made about them, because there was a lot of heroic stuff.
It was certainly a nightmare for the pilots because there were so many restrictions in many of the countries that actually the pilot, who was a Gibraltarian, Mark Carreras, that went over across, and his journey took them to God knows where in some part in Russia in order to then come into China, because there were certain restrictions along the way that so I mean the efforts and that people have put in to contribute to what I did say, as Tim Gibraltar earlier, was enormous, and that is one of many examples that I'm sure that we can talk about.
We have been fortunate that we have never had to decide whether somebody went onto a ventilator or not based on the lack of ventilators.
But I think it all very much changed when the Chief Minister got briefed by the Director of Public Health in late February, and I think at that stage it was press a button, that's the direction of travel, and it was great to see how the whole of the government and all the other just clicked into gear and said there's one focus, which is to get through this.
So we had de novo to create our own contact tracing function, we had to have our own testing function, and ultimately we had to do it on the hoof, which meant that we set up our own public health lab, and we did that in a week. I felt that in the year 2020 I've lived 5 years for the scope of one.
Now, Gibraltar is under the microscope, a test bed for the impact of community vaccination. The outcome is unknown, but there is talk of a return to normal, of hope. Gibraltarian stories of life in the bubble are part of a worldwide narrative, and that is a story that is still being written.